Second session today is a panel discussion titled Global Art Cartographies and New Art Histories. And it's a pleasure to welcome our speakers. We're joined by Anna Arabindan-Kesson, Associate Professor of African American and Black Diasporic Arts, Princeton University. Eddie Chambers, Professor of Art History and African Diaspora Art, the DavidBruton Jr. Centennial Professorship in Art History, University of Texas at Austin. Artist Mithu Sen, and Nina Tonga, Curator of Contemporary Art, Te Papa Tongarewa, Museum of New Zealand. This session will be moderated by Salwa Mikdadi, Professor of Practice of Art History, NYU Abu Dhabi, and Director and Principal Investigator, Al-Mawrid Center for the Study of Art. Each panelist will present first, followed by a moderated discussion, and then a Q&A.
Hello, so abunila botse. And one the listening the listening to chuapse ham o no lignitstin. Real walk stream the black of sepa hotre baristuan. Mra ma uma. So come ligitum so have through while talk constant allowed so rack wow husramba. Ham so like trips up helpfully in block this door. So that up. Hila watum drums. Ik how huslam lab drop reading bria. Who of sleep. Here what so shik on street. Yak me yap. Rep film this soup of plexi okay of street soup duplex number really told it loud. Get up soup stop the top. Gago backward rule of stop the club boot shop. Get come here, you fall shop. Rob, rock streaming the blood with top take your tea. Look at some little tea. Look at save up to cup. Get a little top for support so gay a hack. Oops, the growth from my love. Rap, rock, will stop. Paka over all out of shop tip, the dog what your park, like on the duke at 2 carry description. Like go break a ticket, break up talk out room, live this up. Rack to what I will lick. Whoops, who shop that me up to a pop. I can love up shop. Cow, tile, wake up bottle. Take a look at you come to the click tip up. Cat wood, hack or step up. re ro digi laba strop aka te eko buknika ile ba baisiwa ke kopa ko dikilga top to ni bur strop ade ya ya bau drup ho strop thul rakdo malam du ab a he kopo dik ho pak ko kai thom drik rupo islake I aha to akosi baka I tup akalo hoops to like dub likal malam strop ar alalin alawo ar dis lika o to muru asri ya kutri ba wustu kau tak lep tu tak kyo kuya ada op likal bu rik hurli topa lap pat ket opa dahmti zak atop likal top aka hoi shukpi likidabri di no so lek hop sop rak rudi ya palais I a putin diri a hoisi ke kun ka tu ti a tu ka kan yo bislok ko tu pe bislok pri ko pi kun ki pu ko tu ki tu bli ku tu ko ti ko ti tu pri ki lu ko da ba ko ti pi ri ko tu ko no ko tu ko shuk ko ka kik paka ikundi kili tiki kita pu sikite phorkachi apo oi suisle pundu thu how ho ri kalulu de khao ko down keki op si kek mo kek ka prikus de mulika putim bisu đi coi nếu mà dùng mà ô tô bị chín và cháu đi họ có tàu họ suy cái đó là cái gì lu tắc tắc click click cắt cái cùng cái cắt tích 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 mất mình cũng chẳng mất những cái liếc mình nói rồi bác hộp shop hiểu cho con tao phải chỉ đạo các ông hộp bây giờ và cái hoa nhau chủ xuống ba câu bao cái đi là quay sang đi học thu thế hộp hạt tao kia thì nó sẽ ba phiếu anh là câu tao là câu phun đó hộp phô con sao thôi bố phò phiêu phi thằng bố gì cũng sao là cái thằng bố shit đến được cái nó là so mày nó you là you see bắt cái đó lúc sinh phải ăn một gì bị chập à chắc khi mà thiếu cũng nghe cũng nó đủ quá xỉ liếc cả không đi mới cái câu đưa xí con thì là hộp tôm xí cáiแต่ก็บางเดี๋ยวนี้ทิกกับโกฮิลติ๊กกี่ชั่วติ๊เล็กเอาปั๊มเสริมเด็กคนสีปั๊มดีโอ้สุริละกับป่วยฮับโอ้แต่ทำที่วิจิตรกันบอกดีท่ามาสมัยอันนี้เสียฮิลฮูบหาตะกอนสมันโตรีละก็เสียฮูมฮาร์เรโซดาบายาฮัลเดี๋ยววันนี้ไปชาวเด็กตาบ้าอิลิเซตเขานี่น้องเอาให้ละให้โยว่าให้ยาเล็กเด็กส่งฮับเอาทุนนี่ก็จะที่จมดับเอาทุยสกรีละก็ดับปัดเดสิทีเดละโอลดามโดโลดีโนเด็กสับป้าเราเอาดิสตริกเราไม่รู้ลิกตะกุนรีอีต่อฮิกยี่กูกา엄청 띵똑똑 아까 바깥 앞에 대고 힙힙 쇼파 히 하텍했을때 바꿔 휘어 날 하버데 알라고
Kekka you bedelia. Kako bisukka kiti mchuli wali sheki sotu. Kaun Popi Shopping's lam di testoya. Kiu. Kokop. Tiwo. Bob hui uri gustam. Likum ham so legacy. You wow. You like so sham. Real woo how they come bo. Up some no. Bakom you shum leave so. I'll hold you to this dark how you why I are to. You go to wash it. Like a long pita. Woo ah we. Tom this the live. You go. Kiêu nhấp được chút thắm sức lịch lắm thì kiêu nhiều lắm chứ. Bao phần lắm, hôm nay mình đi sắm top, hop, hôm về storm đang tập là tắc tích hop tắc cái thu tích kiến thu tích cả bắc. Mình sắm lên xong thôi. Ống thơm chim được hông thơm lắm. Đã gặp tích cái tập bắp xíu cái làm chi cái chuyện mình bảo. Chắc đi mua liêm history ở Professorship Dhabi. Đã đã pin là hấp ở không độ hết hitung lịch tích tích bao. Đếch ở liêm mặt hơ tập bị cô đi stop. Hipa hôm him đếch ở trong lịch làm bộ. Wish bút kalam đếch âm thì đắc đô đếch âm tích tích mọc black upchi. Pakom dik mitapan this month rakap tekpim chimbambiki o kakoliki aritis opatotis at yop nam diksi hule baseto kandigo dak hit lakaposh do pai ya mamma Bakang de menu sumdam pub. Lek tekem bat hit on them smooth lick pub. Ham the whole of stomach lick on the condominium shop. Oh, they don't talk you shop bow. Dekom da lick tom ding somehow. Dick house some big lick number from shop trap or uriato a bucket of a lick up. Back and laba tom tea top here. Duck. Dick holy grandmother was chopped the girl leopard hard. Rick the heard Iran bush sticking ya. Obey don't elha cut about honey to the calm udu de boa said cop. Wowly lombard hound the count the kiss like a cool like a bucket the by yup. Dick the three like a home she re wool like a home she dick her. Back how hill like a double turns down by your so thick crowd. That come to stop. Eat out your shop. Just like how deep someone you like a cooking if the pop the kiss of my cup to yap like Leo Bone and go cut the road is about no. I don't need chop top. Like back in up the rolling of border, I can't have push shock in our yard. And I was living this so I can't talk on the was too party like put taking him out in the yard. They hit like the what take a new word. They all look at the boat or the super warrior boat. Like He called the canal, they to stock, legal, use the condo, lick and little count, yet now they can loud, they can top pocket on the clouds, running break a little more with them. So, is all you are so late, they say, how we like it, how it was to way up. It's what who? Who the hips to make him, yeah. I'm so like that, so.
Good morning, everybody. Well, that was a hard act to follow. I can't, so I will do as I can. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Hua, and for your team, the organizers, for bringing us here and taking such beautiful care of us. I'm so grateful. So I never met Okui, but I knew him through his words, which I met as an undergraduate in Perth, where I also came to know the work of artists and amazing writers like Eddie, like Hank, like Lubena Hamid, like Magda. Through them, I also came to know Krista, Salwa, my dear Chika. Their work made space for me to find my voice, and I'm here because of them. I stand on the shoulders of giants. But I'm also here because of artists, and what I want to say today really is this. If new art histories are to be made, we need to follow the lead of artists who are already doing that work of reconceptualizing our relationship to geography and new temporal encounters. The second point or method I want to try and activate here is the theme of the biennial itself. For me, at least, an important direction we can take as art historians is to remember how we got here, to remember why we are in the present, in this present, and to search for the other histories we might need for the futures we want to build. So my talk is really a kind of montage, a series of snapshots and something like an homage to the artists whose work I think can point us to new directions. So I'm going to start a little before the 1960s. I am an art historian of the 19th century primarily, just to remind us of who came before. And the first line that you're reading here is from David F. Dorr's travel narrative, which he published in 1851, and it's an invitation to join him, an enslaved man, on his grand tour. Now, Dorr traveled through Italy around the same time as the African-American artist Robert S. Duncanson, and both men really are fascinated by Italy as this space where the past was continually emerging in the present. For David Dorr, this temporal juxtaposition leads him to make a spatial one, and throughout his text, he really reimagines Europe as a site for the convergence of multiple networks and legacies that emphasize Africa's significance in creating Western civilization. For David Dorr, these histories, as they would later for Frederick Douglass, remind him that Europe is already global. And this is a history that Joy Gregory also evokes in her work. Joy's photographs draw attention to the dream work of Europe, both as a place of migration and European dreams of resource extraction from Africa. This dream work of European imperialism financed nation building, a relationship that she contrasts with the ongoing significance and hostility towards migration and migrant labor in Europe. Juxtaposing popular culture with these visions of art historical significance, Joy materializes what is otherwise unseen to reorientate our perspective, to show us multiple experiences of place simultaneously. are drawing out these entanglements of geography and the circuits of meaning that cohere in a term like the global also underpins Lubaina Hamid's practice. And Lubaina, perhaps more than anyone, has really taught me about writing new art histories. And in an early work from 2002 called Cotton.com, she installed this grid of small black and white pattern canvases across from this brass plaque with that quote written on it. And this is just a more recent installation of the work. These cotton canvases evoke forms of digital communication, and they reference letters written by factory workers in Manchester who were anti-slavery and who sent these letters to Abraham Lincoln. She's also thinking of these canvases as spaces of convergence, as materializing these imaginary moments of physical connection that cotton created between factory operatives in Lancashire and enslaved black people in the US South. Lubaina's canvases also materialize other geographies of market relations. These canvases imitate 18th and 19th century textile samples that were made in Manchester that were also imitations of Indian-made cottons for the West African market. And if we put Lubaina's work next to an 18th century painting by Agostino Brunias, for example, we come to notice, I think, that more clearly the interconnected material worlds of Indian and Atlantic Ocean communities, a set of connections, of course, that Yinka has also been drawing out, where cloth was both currency and commodity, used to pay for and sell enslaved people like those depicted here. Cotton.com was also a work that was used to memorialize this transatlantic slave trade and its significance in sustaining both Manchester's and Britain's kind of imaginary as a kind of global marketplace and sustaining and making those connections between slavery and Britain's industrial and cultural modernity. It's a work that's constructed from archives and ephemera, but it also materializes the 19th century transnational networks that shaped art history's emergence as a discipline. But Lubaina moves beyond the sort of academic teleology of progression, of movement towards the modern or the postmodern or, wherever we might be now. Rather, she's drawing from these historical processes of enslavement and colonialism as a way to look and think relationally. Her spatial juxtapositions in this work of the relationship between colony and metropole, I think, offer a model for art historical orientations that are concerned with the generative possibilities encoded in processes of global dispersal and dislocation. Her spatiality also really resonates with Ingrid Pollard's practice, who has for a long time been collapsing the distance between what Stuart Hall described as Britain's outside and inside histories. Ingrid reminds us of the not-so-hidden pasts that are embedded in the most bucolic of British landscapes. But she also asks us to look outside the frame. Often her figures are sort of looking outwards, out of the work, cultivating a sidelong glance, which reminds me really of these earlier kinds of plantation cartographies that really emphasize the centrality of these plantation and slave economies to the business of nation building and modes of cultural production. Both Lubaina and Ingrid work between these artifacts of the past and these formations of the present, moving between historical memory and historical ellipsis, and give us counter-archives from which to begin building new kinds of futures and perhaps new kinds of art histories. We might ask, of course, where these global histories go in the formation of a discipline like art history, because if art history does have any world-building potential, then I think it should be orientating us to the practices of viewing, of relating, and of valuing each other that center both this dislocation and relationality, the disorientation and the affinities embedded in the colonial histories encoded in the term global. This is not just my idea, it's evoked in the sense of dislocation described in Ranjit Guha's essay, The Migrant's Time. It's encoded in the movement described in Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, and it forms part of the alienation that writers like Jamaica Kincaid, Samuel Salvin, and of course Hazel Carby, describe as they negotiate moving between metropole and colony, between archival pasts and their legacies in the present. I think it's also beautifully evoked in Amitav Ghosh's trilogy Sea of Poppies that coheres around the cataclysmic effects of enslavement and indenture and the connections also emergent in these histories across communities in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific oceans. So when thinking about how one might write with such a perspective, I want to briefly highlight the work of 3 contemporary artists who have actually returned to the plantation as a site of displacement and possibility. The plantation is something like art history's dirty little secret. It really underpins the development, as I said, of Western modernity, but also of our discipline. Yet its presence is so often ghostly, right, at best in the narratives of art that we tell. The plantation was an incredibly mobile space that connected communities across the Indian, the Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. And actually, the African-American sociologist and writer and thinker W.E.B. Du Bois actually emphasizes its potential as a site for a revolutionary, anti-imperial, subaltern solidarity in 1946 in this speech. And now, decades later, artists are returning to the plantation in different ways as a process of repair, of restoration, while foregrounding the plantation as a site from which to forge new modes of solidarity and connection. But I'm going to start with the work of Shiraz Beju, who also has work in the biennial. He's a Mauritian British artist, and he really focuses on and deconstructs the migratory histories of the Indian Ocean. For him, the plantation is both subject and theoretical frame. It's a space of interconnectedness, and this is an idea that he's understanding through the Martinican philosopher Edward Glissant's concept of the poetics of relation. So Shiraz explores this by primarily repurposing often small and seemingly unremarkable archival objects. Maps and photographs, for example. This is from a shot from 2019 when he was also in this biennial. And he creates new connections between them. He also, in the way he constructs his installations and uses different forms of media, encourages a closeness and interactivity with his work, so that he's literally sort of creating these new perspectives for viewers as they move through his installations. Mauritius was often described in the 19th century as a plantation island, and it was a site of heavy resource extraction. Much of Shiraz's work is focused on deconstructing this concept of Mauritius by positioning the island within broader and shifting geographies of the Indian Ocean and its various ecologies. In his photographs, for example, the land registers these multiple encounters between the human and non-human interactions that continue to reorder the landscape and reflect migratory routes between Africa and India in particular, that for him can help us rethink Mauritius beyond these extractive practices of European plantation imaginaries. By bringing these other networks into view, Shiraz is also interested in emphasizing strategies and subtleties of survival. So for example, in En Famille, he uses historical photographs to materialize these overlapping temporal histories of Mauritius, while using portraiture to also memorialize those who have labored on the plantation but whose lives are rarely documented in the archive. The materiality of repurposing, and yes, I did color coordinate today, the materiality of repurposing and layering is so evident, I think, in these works, as these women emerge from the colors of the sea and as around them clouds gather and disperse, offering moments of clarity and then opacity. It's as well as materializing what I think is sort of his thought process, These works also invite us to watch a process of building new constellations of meaning and connection, constellations that for Shiraz are really the groundwork from which new solidarities can be built, particularly in the face of continued climate crisis. Shiraz has described this practice of portraiture to me as laying people to rest. And this sense of care and restoration really also resonates with the practice of Jasmine Toga Brisby, who was a fourth-generation Australian South Sea Islander artist from Queensland, which was the site of another slave trade. Australian South Sea Islanders are the Australian-born direct descendants of people kidnapped and brought to the country from 80 Pacific islands between 1863 and 1904 to work as indentured labourers, mostly in the sugar industry. And Jasmine's practice extends from her family history. Her great-great-grandparents were kidnapped from Vanuatu as children. So many Australian South Sea Islanders were also deported back to Pacific Islands following the passing of the White Australia policy in 1904. So this history of enslavement has really been sidelined and erased in Australia. And so for Jasmine, bringing what is hidden into public memory is really central. In this work, she's made this pile of skulls that are cast in unrefined sugar and that slowly gave off a sickly, sweet smell, as the exhibition went on. The work was a response to the discovery of an unmarked mass grave of Australian South Sea Islander people on a former plantation in North Queensland. And for her, the grave is a profound metaphor, both for the silencing of her community's histories from the public sphere, but it's also a metaphor for the loss of culture and language that her community has experienced. In another series called The Past is Ahead, Don't Look Back, she uses a collodion photographic process to emulate 19th century practices in order to literally step back into the archive. And in this act of animation, she produces a space of coexistence where she can stand with her ancestors, memorializing and mourning their loss. For Jasmine, art is a form of archival care and a form of witness. She activates familial memories, destabilizing the official record, but also creating a language that her community can use to recontextualize their local experiences in relation to global histories of Indian and Atlantic Ocean slavery and indenture. So in a sense, I think in Jasmine's work, the plantation and its historical representation are spaces where these different modes of coexistence, temporal, familial, trans-regional, can really emerge. And this is a spatial reorientation that I think is also at the center of Annalee Davis's practice, and Annalee's work is also in the biennial. Annalee draws very much from the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter's notion of the plot, which is an area in Caribbean plantations where enslaved people might have been able to grow their own food. And David thinks very much about human and non-human coexistence and forms of reciprocity by really focusing on the soil itself as a site of embodied knowledge and shared memory. Drawing on the concept of phytoremediation, which refers to the process by which certain plants are able to detoxify water and land, she uses these plant histories to memorialize the knowledge systems of formerly enslaved communities, to address the agricultural and social degradation created by the plantation economy and now tourism in Barbados, and to create new grounds for healing and repair. So in this work, she made this glass planter that allowed viewers to see the soil profile of a specially curated plot where plants with medicinal properties are grown. She also provided viewers with digital tools so they could learn more about the soil and the plants itself. Her practice is very centered around participation and interactivity, and accessibility in that sense. And in Bush Tea Services from 2016, she actually repurposed shards of pottery found on plantation sites in and around her home, and she actually lives on what was a former plantation, into a tea set in which she served sweetened bush tea, brewed from plants harvested from the area she lives on, and served them to an audience, and sort of created this space for conversation around these histories. honouring the women and men who planted, used and cared for each other with these bush medicines, this piece, and I think she performed versions of it here too, recalibrates our position from observer to something like witness, directing our attention to these practices of healing, survivance and refusal. Like Shiraz and Jasmine, Annalee creates the ground, forms the space from which to articulate different modes of connection for each other and the land that emerge from, perhaps because of these plantation histories, but are never contained by them. So I said at the beginning that I'm here because of artists, and this is why. To encounter these artists' work is to both negotiate the processes of dispersal that have made many of us, including me, global, but also to hold on to, write with, and from the relationalities these histories have made possible. If we let it, the work of these artists can reorientate our approach to influence and the influences of the past. They can help us pay attention to what came before, not to propel this kind of endless art historical search for technical breakthrough, but as a way to reimagine art history itself as a form of radical citationality, to quote from Catherine McKittrick, a practice that sees and acknowledges what had to happen to get us here, that pays attention to moments of convergence and affiliation that form the discipline's own entangled histories, and finds ways of writing from and into being its migrations, encounters, and errant paths. Thank you.
Excuse me 1 second. Okay, thank you so much. I'll make a start as time is of the essence. There was a time when Black British art histories were a relatively uncomplicated matter. Historically, and of course, we now know that we can certainly speak of such a thing. Historically, the curating or creating of Black British art histories were, for the most part, centered on correcting or addressing the systemic absences of such artists. This making visible of marginalized, excluded, or not widely known histories was what characterized the first substantial attempt at chronicling of Black British art history, which was Rashid Areen's 1989 exhibition, The Other Story. Given the historical tenuousness of Black artists in British art history, Areen's endeavor was a landmark exhibition which sought to outline a history of, quote-unquote, Afro-Asian artists in post-war Britain. I have a number of images. I'm just going to run through them fairly quickly. For the most part, they're images of The Other Story when it was shown in Wolverhampton and Manchester after its initial showing at the Hayward Gallery in London in 1989. And these are installation shots of the exhibitions, as I say, between Wolverhampton Art Gallery and Manchester City Art Gallery and the Corner House in Manchester. I'm sure you'll recognise some of the artists and indeed some of the work. Okay, I'm just going to go back a second. The exhibition was conceived and curated by Areen and organised by Hayward Gallery in South Bank Centre, London. And Areen also did pretty much all of the catalogue's heavy lifting insofar as he wrote all of its major chapters. Inevitably, perhaps, the other story was not without its critics. Even before the exhibition opened, there were a number of high-profile artists, including Anish Kapoor and Veronica Ryan, who declined to participate in what they considered to be a suspect curatorial undertaking, broadly citing a perception that the exhibition prioritized certain considerations of ethnicity above and beyond considerations of the art itself. The artists themselves did not publicly divulge their reasons for not participating in the exhibition, so we perhaps have good cause to be circumspect in our speculation. Several black women artists expressed the view that the other story marginalized their practices. In light of these considerations, we perhaps have good reason to think of the other story as Areen's story. The exhibition featured work by some 24 artists who included Areen himself, Salim Arif, Frank Bowling, Sonia Boyce, Mona Hatoum, Lubaina Himid, Gavin Yanchez, Roald Moody, Keith Piper, A.J. Shemza, F.N. Souza, and Aubrey Williams. Of course, those were some of the artists in the exhibition. That's not a definitive list. During the course of the relatively long period of time during which the other story was in preparation, no fewer than 4 of the 24 artists included in the eventual exhibition died. I think Areen first proposed the exhibition in around about 1984, so there's a considerable time lag between him proposing the exhibition and the show opening. A 5th, Aubrey Williams, lived just about long enough to witness the realization of the exhibition, dying in April 1990, a few months after the other story opened in London. Had the Hayward Gallery taken up the exhibition when it had first been proposed by Areen, then Roald Moody, Ahmed Parvez, Ivan Perez, and A.J. Shemza would all have lived to see their work in the show. As it turned out, their involvement was posthumous. Most of the artists found themselves swept up in vociferous reactions to the exhibition, perhaps typified by the Evening Standard art critic Brian Sewell, whose review of the show was titled Black Pride and Prejudice. That's the image of the review. Underneath the title, in enlarged type, was the following quote, "They argue that they are rejected and ignored when they are nothing of the kind," unquote. Within the review, Sewell was described as Critic of the Year, and in language which would come to see him excel as a pantomime villain of choice during the following decade, he opined, "Apart from Sonia Boyce and Donald Locke, we've seen it all before. Having either no tradition of their own or tradition so exhausted that no nourishment is to be drawn from them, these artists parrot Western visual idioms that they do not understand and that have been exposed as silly and pretentious. That they should demand serious attention for their third-rate imitations of the white man's cliché must seem outrageous to all who care to judge art by quality. Talent in the white West is an extremely rare phenomenon, and most Western art is indifferent at best. I see no reason to distort the judgment that damns it so as to praise the work of artists just as bad or worse because they make a noisy business of being black." Just as an aside, the final part of the sentence is crucial. Artists perceived as making a noisy business of being black. What we see in many respects in the 1990s is the ascendancy of artists who are not perceived as making, quote unquote, a noisy business of being black, but that's a separate issue to what I'm trying to share at the present time. A measure of the importance of the other story might be gauged if and when we consider that prior to the arrival of the exhibition at the Hayward Gallery, London, there was no perceptible sense that either academia in the UK or the art world in the UK, let me read that again. I think I misread a sentence. Prior to the arrival of the exhibition, there was no perceptible sense within either academia in the UK or the art world in the UK that Black British artists had any sort of history. The common art world refrain right up to the mid-1980s was, quote unquote, there are no black artists, meaning, perhaps more accurately, there are no black artists of merit or worth. The sentiment of invisibilizing was echoed at all levels of academia, which not only refused to teach histories of Black British artists, but was also extremely reluctant to offer MA, MPhil or PhD places to students wishing to research and study these histories. But more than 3 decades on from Marine's endeavour, when it comes to considerations of the current standing of Black British artists, complications now abound. Of course, there have always been issues of complexities, complications, but I'm going to focus on a particular manifestation of complications around what I termed the title of the talk, The Curious Progress of Black British Artists. Sorry, just lost my place for a minute. Okay. The casual observer might perhaps be struck by the extent to which, within Britain itself, a number of artists of colour have been conspicuously brought into the fold of British art by way of the awarding of honours from the late Her Majesty the Queen, and now, of course, His Majesty the King, or the bestowing of the status of Royal Academician by that august institution. The likes of Salim Arif, Frank Bowling, Sonia Boyce, Sakari Douglas Camp, Mubena Hamid, and Yinka Shonibari. I'm just going to pass through images of their trips to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle very briefly. And I should mention Shonibari. Shonibari, when he was awarded his MBE, very quickly appropriated it, in a manner of speaking, into his identity as an artist, henceforth or thereafter being known as Yinka Shonibari MBE. And of course, when he got a CBE, it's changed to Yinka Shonibari CBE. So these artists have all made a trip or several trips to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle to collect awards such as, in ascending order of importance, MBE, which stands for Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, OBE, which stands for Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or CBE, which is Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. So CBE is the most important. I think I said in ascending order. So MBE is the kind of the more modest, if that's appropriate term. Then OBE is above an MBE, and then a CBE is above an OBE. Of course, there are also knighthoods and other awards, which I might touch on in this paper. Let me see, where am I? Though it appeared that amongst people from an ethnic minority background who accepted such honours, the majority were given the more modest OBE, in recent years, David Adjaye, the celebrated architect and sometime collaborator with Christopher Feely, was awarded one of the supreme male gongs, which is a knighthood, entitling him in the UK as a Knight of the Realm to be referred to, or to be addressed, I should perhaps more correctly say, as Sir David. The most recent Black British artists to receive knighthoods were John Ackhamfra. Sorry, these are still images of David Adjaye, but where am I? The most recent Black British artists to receive knighthoods were John Ackhamfra and Isaac Julian. who are now entitled to be addressed, as I mentioned earlier, as Sir John and Sir Isaac, respectively. To the likes of the above can be added the not insignificant number of names of other Black British artists, photographers, filmmakers, arts workers, curators, and so on, upon whom honours have been similarly conferred. The ever-growing list includes Sir Corrie Douglas Camp, Ingrid Pollard, David A. Bailey, Mike Seeley, Claudette Johnson, and Barbara Walker. It also includes Denzel Forrester, who was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire in the 2021 New Year's Honours List for services to art, and Veronica Ryan, who we'll see here. Given an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List that recognises, quote, the outstanding achievements of people across the United Kingdom, unquote. And Veronica Ryan got her OBE in June 2021. It is in some respects difficult to keep up with the scale and pace of these artists being awarded honours, as some receive multiple gongs, while others, thus far at least, have received only one. Steve McQueen, for example, was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire in the 2002 Birthday Honours List, Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 2011 New Year's Honours List for services to the visual arts, and was knighted in the 2020 New Year's Honours List for services to film. I should make it clear that in the UK, the monarch dispenses honours twice a year, firstly at New Year and secondly at the time of his or her birthday. It would perhaps, or it would certainly, need dedicated, time-consuming research to establish which artist had received which award and when. Another complication, and certainly a very interesting one, is the reason given for the award. Lubaina Himid received her MBE in June 2010 for services to Black women's art, though by the time of receiving her CBE, some 8 years later, in the 2018 Queen's Birthday Honours List, this was for services to art. Some might feel or believe that their honour can be uncoupled from their ethnicity or uncoupled from racial dimensions, but on occasion the link is explicit. For example, Isaac Julian was made a Knight Bachelor by King Charles III at Windsor Castle for services to diversity and inclusion in the arts. I'm very mindful of time, so I need to jump forward a little bit. I should make it clear that the monarch has absolutely nothing to do with who gets an honour. These discussions are taken by the Cabinet Office, a secretive branch of the government, whichever political party is in power at the time. The Conservatives have been in power for 12 years, following the general election in May 2010. Although the Conservatives have thrived on anti-immigrant, on the vilest, most nasty anti-immigrant rhetoric, and have been quick to demonise immigrants as a way of pandering to British race prejudice, these same Conservatives have seen to it that increasing numbers of people from ethnic minorities, including numbers of Black artists, have been brought into the fold of the honours system. Within the context of such recognition, it might perhaps be the case that systemic absences of black artists from British art are no longer an absolute given. The experiences of a significant number of individual Black British artists have on occasion included periods of momentary embrace and recognition, followed by periods of summary and protracted marginalisation. This has been a pattern since the decades of the mid-20th century, and it has only been in recent decades that certain artists have been able to maintain a momentum of success, or at least the lavish and conspicuous embracing of certain favoured Black British artists has very effectively masked the wholesale and widespread marginalisation of far greater numbers of practitioners, languishing in what I would describe as a type of functional obscurity. Might the late 20th, early 21st century embrace and recognition of a clutch of favoured Black British artists, including those honoured with gongs, have masked the sorts of inequalities that gave rise and necessitated the other story? The major galleries of London, such as the ICA, the Serpentine, the Whitechapel, have, after all now hosted main space solo exhibitions of Black British artists' work. I mentioned main space. This is an important aspect because Black British artists have either been put in group exhibitions in large numbers, or they've occupied peripheral spaces within these institutions. But in recent years, a number of artists have had solo exhibitions, which of course is the highest accolade that can be given to an artist in the main spaces of these institutions. So it's important to stress that. This is of unbounded consequence, given that the solo show in the major gallery is in many respects the ultimate art world accolade that can be bestowed on an artist. But my concern is not with artists and exhibitions that lend themselves to celebratory notions of progress. Each of the select number of favoured Black artists is taken by the art world as proof and evidence of its racial equity, meaning, of course, that the greater number of Black artists who are ignored are of no great consequence, and of no importance, and are condemned to languish in varying degrees of obscurity. The changing of the times, and arguably perhaps the changing of the fortunes of at least some Black British artists, might also be ascertained in the material status of Frank Boulding, which we've touched on in this discussion, but I'll leave it at that because my time is out. A great deal happened to Black British artists between the other story, taking place as it did at the end of the 1980s, and the present time, the early stages of the third decade of the 21st century. The conferring of honours on the people previously mentioned can perhaps be set in dialogue with the nature of the press coverage a number of these artists currently receive. The meteoric rise to art world superstardom of the likes of McQueen, Chris Ofili, and Yinka Shonibari was characterised by perceptible and important shifts in the ways in which such artists were written about. Black artists went from having their work and exhibitions largely ignored by the British mainstream press to being the subject of celebrity features that presupposed a level of familiarity with these artists' practices. I just jump to my conclusion, my time is out. It is now possible, without hyperbole, to regard a number of Black British artists as establishment figures. These artists are, furthermore, more likely to be amongst those selected as the state's artists of choice for the adornment of public buildings and other such undertakings, such as the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. I'll just show you very quickly. My time is gone, but I'll just show you Yinka Shonibari, fourth plinth from a number of years ago. We see Black artists drawn into the Tate in conspicuous ways. We see Hugh Locke and more recently Shali Kumari Berman. The abiding question, though, is where does all this leave art world racism? Can we no longer identify or speak of such a thing? Are we in some sort of post-racial nirvana in which the systemic mistreatment of Black artists is no longer a matter or statement of fact? We might be inclined to think of one society such as that of the UK as being a meritocracy, but make no mistake, Britain's obsession with its so-called royal family points not to a meritocracy, the holding of power by people selected on the basis of their ability, but an aristocracy, a group regarded as privileged or superior in a particular sphere. Okay, I think I'd better stop there and maybe just fast forward to the final sentence. Some people break ranks with the requested protocol and make it known that they have refused an honour. So there's a protocol that if you are offered an honour, should you not be inclined to accept it, that you don't publicly state that you've turned it down. Though for the most part, such stories are granted hardly any attention in comparison to the celebration of those honoured with an MBE, OBE, CBE or knighthood, which garner much more press attention. Okay, thank you so much. I'm over time by a couple of minutes, for which I apologise. Thank you.
I'm trying to beat the timer, so o ko kolege hu whanga he ngahi whakatapu ko siana hawhaki ka e tāki ate au ke o whakahoko atu e whinua tu ani. Ko hoko hingoa ko ni ne Tonga, ko kulele mai me kolo fo o pe mo vai ni e Tonga tapu. O ko whakamalo lahi atu ki he hoa pe he Shaja Foundation, pe he ki he Salwa ana Mithu mo iri, pe mo ki mo toko to pe o kuheni. I greet you in Lea Whakatonga, the language of my people from the kingdom of Tonga. And it always gets me emotional. I'm very far from home. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge all the Indigenous peoples and elders, past, present, and emerging, for who have hosted us in this beautiful place over the last week. I'd also like to acknowledge the Shaja Foundation for their generous invitation and also the hospitality that you have cared so well for us in this week. I acknowledge my esteemed panelists and everyone who is joining us here today for these important discussions, as well as those that will be joining online. Upon reflecting on this panel of global cartographies and new art histories and experiencing this amazing biennial and thinking about the last 2 decades, I want to begin my presentation by first locating myself within this global conversation and to anchor myself firmly in Oceania, a region that is home for me, and a region that encompasses 28 nation states and territories over diverse geographic, demographic, cultural, and economic scales, spanning the vast Pacific Ocean, which covers 1/3 of the world's surface. The late Tongan academic Abeli Hauofa conceptualized the Pacific Ocean as a sea of islands, where the Pacific Ocean operated as a highway connecting the islands through social and genealogical lineages that crisscross all the way across Oceania and probably back. In this paper, I want to reflect on the ways in which these ancestral networks and Indigenous mobilities have enabled the making of new art histories that speak to Indigenous persistence across Oceania. I want to also challenge the very notion of new as being up to date or modern in contrast to the old in a linear sense of time. Rather, I want to reposition the idea of new within an Indigenous temporality that is common across Oceania, where the past is firmly in front of you in the present and you walk backwards into the future. And I like to describe this as moonwalking into the future, because you do it with style and you do it with pace. Such an orientation to the past is not romantic, it is eminently practical, for the future is unknown, yet the past, which is rich in knowledge and insights, can inform the decisions, actions, and behaviours in the present. It is within this Indigenous temporality that I want to position the making of new art histories as a constant state of becoming in the present. Hawaiian scholar and activist Dr. Emalani Case describes this in relation to a very personal commitment, and she says, and I quote, "A commitment to the process of creation, future building, dreaming, storytelling, and Indigenous persistence that enabled our survival in the past, that will allow our ancientness to be in a constant state of becoming in the present." In this presentation, I want to talk to the work of 3 artists from across Oceania: Lisa Reihana, an artist from Aotearoa, New Zealand; Jasmine Togo-Brisby, who I know my dear colleague Anna has already spoken about, from Australia; and Bernice Akamine of Hawaii. All women who are championing this sense of an Indigenous temporality and really helping us to re-engage and reactivate the connections that have sustained Oceania. It is important to note the Indigenous positionalities of these artists really build on the activisms and advances of previous decades. The 1970s in particular is a time when many Pacific Island nations were increasingly gaining sovereignty from colonial oversight and forging new pathways for self-determination. This manifested in the visual arts, where artists, largely women, reflected more explicitly local political and social commentary. And a great example of this is the work of Māori artist Robin Kahukiwa, who was included in the Sharjah Biennial. Perhaps the most formative shift that occurred happened in the late 1990s, where scholars and activists across the region argued for Indigenous peoples to construct their own representations and articulate their own approaches to knowledge. Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's groundbreaking book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, first published in 1999, offered a range of entry points for researchers and artists alike to develop practices that strategically employed Indigenous and decolonial frameworks and epistemologies. She writes on the process of Indigenous writing and research, and I quote, that it is not a rejection of all theory or research of Western knowledge. Rather, it is about centering our own concerns and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. The kind of groundswell of this moment echoed across artistic practice, but also influenced a number of shifts within the infrastructure that supports arts across Oceania. In particular, I want to acknowledge the kind of important impact of Te Papa, our National Museum in New Zealand, which opened in 1998, so around the same time. Te Papa is a bicultural institution. It's also where I work. And what is unique about Te Papa is that it acknowledges the unique position of Māori, our Indigenous peoples, and the need to secure the participation of Māori in the governance and the management and the operation of the museum. Our museology is shaped by our bicultural ethos, but also by a very important principle, which we call mana taonga. Broadly speaking, mana taonga is a term in te reo, the Māori language. Mana taonga is a concept, and is practiced by Te Papa, recognises that there exists living spiritual and cultural relationships between peoples and their taonga. And taonga is a term that will translate to cultural belonging, albeit tangible or intangible. And they have these connections through whakapapa, the term for genealogy. And this could be a genealogy that connects them to a particular taonga. It could be perhaps to the ancestors of whom a taonga has a particular name or a history, or it could be to the whānau or family, to the hapu, a subset of a larger iwi or tribe, to whom the taonga is an heirloom. Mana taonga as a concept is an enduring concept, and it recognises the rights of Indigenous peoples, but we extend this to include artists and the communities that we work with, to taonga held in our care. The concept also promotes collaboration, access for communities, and it also decenters the curator as the sole knowledge holder. It recognises that while a curator will have expertise in a particular area and specialist knowledge, their knowledge is not encyclopedic. And so we are forced into a way, not forced, we choose to work in a way that constantly draws on the knowledge and the expertise of customary knowledge holders or communities or artists. It's within this landscape that I want to kind of set the context for discussing the work of these 3 artists. And I want to begin with Lisa Reihana. Lisa Reihana is a Māori multidisciplinary artist who's also has also participated in the Sharjah Biennial in the past. And I want to speak in particular to this work, which some of you may have seen in the 2017 Venus Biennale, the In Pursuit of Venus Infected. This particular work is projected across a 25-metre screen. It immerses the viewer in a reimagined Pacific island inspired by the neoclassical French scenic wallpaper, Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique. The scenic wallpaper, or the original wallpaper, was set in an exoticized Tahiti, and it was inspired by scenes drawn from published accounts and illustrations of European voyages across Oceania, most notably the voyages of Captain James Cook. The wallpaper's imperialistic vision of the Pacific reinforced the notion of the noble savage, and the hedonistic accounts of the Pacific as an earthly paradise, a new Cytherea. The benevolence of the scenic wallpaper, like many of the illustrative voyaging accounts, often obscured the clashes and the violent exchanges between the foreign explorers and the indigenous island inhabitants. The few instances that deviate from this in the wallpaper, such as the death of Captain Cook, are often minimized and banished to the background. Where the original wallpaper chose to avert their eyes to the realities of colonial exploration, Reihana's scrolling panorama brings them to the fore in theatrical vignettes that capture the curiosity, confusion, desire, and predation of European exploration across Oceania. Each vignette is cast with actors, many Māori or of Pacific heritage, who reimagine popular illustrations, such as the wrestling men of a boxing match in Ha'apai, 1784 by John Webber. These are accompanied by a cacophony of sounds, taonga pūoro, chanting, dialogue, and environmental sounds that enliven what were once static illustrations. They also embellish narratives that were often omitted from the original wallpaper, the floggings, the sexual trade, and the cultural clashes. Through the vignettes, Reihana also balances these narratives with imagery of resistance to encounter. Images of islanders going about their daily lives, ignoring the voyages that are on their lands, and perhaps engaging in ceremonies of mourning or in adornment practices, dancing and oratory. Since its presentation at the 2017 Venice Biennale, it has circumnavigated the globe, reaching many of the shores that Captain Cook himself once visited. For audiences for whom the legacies of Cook are deeply entrenched in place, Reihana's cultural critique opens up and affirms other perspectives and forms of agency that are often omitted from the official histories of encounter. The acronym of the work, POV, has a double meaning, of course, referring to Captain Cook's first voyage to observe the transit of the planet of Venus, but also refers to the cinematic acronym point of view, which suggests the potential for differing and perhaps challenging perspectives. These kinds of inherited legacies, the idea of transmission and being able to talk back, is also at the heart of another artist that you've been introduced to already, Jasmine Toggle-Brisby. Jasmine Toggle-Brisby is a fourth-generation Australian South Sea Islander artist. Her great-grandparents were taken from Vanuatu as children and put to work on an Australian sugarcane plantation. They were part of over 60,000 people from across Oceania that were coerced into labour. This trade, as Anna has mentioned, began in the 1800s and went on for over 40 years and was known as blackbirding. Across Oceania, the painful memory of the sudden disappearances of people from the beach and the sight of strange ships moored to the shore lingers in the cautionary lyrics of songs and in the stories we tell ourselves. For their descendants, such as Jasmine, the visual and cultural material of blackbirding in the sugarcane industry are central not only to her practice, but to the formation of diasporic culture and the identity of Australian South Sea Islanders. In these photographs, which I'll just touch on lightly and move to the next work, what she has done is co-opted these historical photographs of Australian South Sea Islanders. And in these photographs, which is very typical of photographs of this time, the subjects of the photographs are unnamed. They are, in these two images, simply referred to as Kanaka women, or worse, as commodities, as recruits. By appropriating these images and inserting herself in one image and on the other her daughter, she's inserting herself and creating a visual genealogy that connects and reframes these unknown figures as ancestor figures. Her process asserts that these inherited images are not fixed in the past, but they embody the living air of a people. Adopting this perspective, she sees in these images not unknown sugar plantation workers, but members of her family. Her most recent work, Open City in Suspension, uses the icon of the slave ship in what our historian Cheryl Finley calls a symbolic possession of the past. The ship form hovers low in the gallery. It's almost pressing upon you. You look up to see the work, and she has created a series of Wonderlook-inspired tin press metals, and I've got a close-up here. These ornamental ceiling panels were produced by the Wonderlook family business, and they can be found in many civic buildings in New Zealand and Australia, and they are painstakingly preserved as heritage objects. For Toga Brisby, these panels and their upkeep are an enduring physical manifestation of a colonial legacy. Her great-grandparents were acquired in 1899 as house-slaved by the Wonderlook family. Her panels, or her reimagining of the panels, they portray how entangled her own history is with the history of the Wonderlook family. Here she has inserted an image of her daughter in profile, but also images of sugarcane plants, of crows, and of course of ships. These become motifs that recur across Janlin's practice as a conscious effort to take hold of memory that speaks to the entangled inheritance that she is working and living with. When I asked her about this, she said they are replicated or recurring across her practice to ensure a legacy that will never die. The final artwork I want to discuss, I also want to give a bit of context to, took place in the Honolulu Biennial in 2019, which I curated alongside Josh Tengan and Devin Bella. Other than the Asia-Pacific Triennial of Queensland Art Gallery, the Honolulu Biennial, which is now known as the Hawaii Triennial, is the only Pacific or oceanic-focused biennial of its kind. With this particular biennial, we were inspired by our teachings, by the idea that biennials, as Okui states, could be place-making events, but also about the idea that we could centralize our own stories and our networks that was common and that we shared across Oceania. Within this approach, we wanted to be unapologetic about the issues that we raised, about allowing artists to take the lead and to take us into the issues that matter, climate change, looking at decolonization, but also in the idea that our histories are enduring. One project that really embodies this that I want to speak to is the work of Bernice Akamine, a senior Kanaka Māori artist based in Hawaii, Big Island. I want to talk not just about the work, but about the journey of the work, the way in which that it follows this lineage that I'm trying to speak to this morning. In our conversations with Bernice about the work, about what she would present, she proposed the idea of kalo, which is an existing sculptural installation of 87 kalo sculptures. Kalo is the Hawaiian term for taro. These sculptures have at the base a stone form that then have leaves that are made out of copies of the signature papers of the 1897 Huia Loho Aina and anti-annexation petitions. And on the other side of these leaves were also hand-drawn maps of traditional land divisions of the five islands that are represented in the petitions. Rather than offer us a single presentation, Bernice's proposal was to undertake a journey that follows the path of the original petitions that actually went via San Francisco to Washington, D.C. to be presented to the US Senate. After her work would go on this journey, she proposed that it would come back to Hawaii, to Iolani Palace for its final leg of the journey, to its final display at Iolani Hale Judiciary Building, where the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom took place. The final leg of the journey then was a ceremonial procession that involved descendants of petition signers, members of the community, and school children, each gathered outside Iolani Palace carrying a single kalo sculpture. They began facing the balcony of the room where the late Queen Niukalani, the last monarch of Hawaii, was imprisoned. Students from Hawaii Immersion School in Waianae and the artist Bernice herself performed oli or chants before the procession began. The procession from Iolani Palace followed the path that Queen Ilokalani herself would have taken the last time she visited 4 days before the illegal overthrow of her monarchy. The procession followed the artists and the procession allowed the artists in the Hawaiian community to walk their histories, to carry the names of their ancestors through the work, to activate the history of place. As members of the procession walked across the street, they offered oli or chants, some wept. They cleared the way for remembering and for healing. For the young school children, it may have been the very first time that they had engaged with this history, and what they were engaged with was a creation of a memory that ensures their enduring connection to this history. While I have spoken, I think I should show you the final presentation. While I have spoken specifically about art, I want to end my presentation by talking about how these enduring connections, these lineages are living in the present. And I want to give an example of the way that these are activated, not just in the arts, but in our activism. And this example comes from the 24th of July in 2019. Utah-based Tongan educator Anabesika Ili took to social media to call upon the Tongan diaspora living in Hawaii and across the United States of America to make their way to Mauna Kea to honour their duty to stand and kapu aloha with Hawaiians. The call to action honoured an enduring relationship between King Kalakaua through a letter he sent to King George Dupol I of the Kingdom of Tonga in 1886. And in this letter, he solidifies the ancestral ties between their monarchies at a particular moment where they were both facing growing imperial interest in Oceania. When Anapesi sent out her call, a digital copy of this historic letter circulated once again across the different networks of both kingdoms. The following day, a delegation of over 100 Tongans gathered in Mauna Kea to show their solidarity and support. Both of these callings for actions are the kinds of art histories that are still in the making, and I want to acknowledge this particular publication that has really come out in the last 5 years, Ate, Journal of Māori Art, as a place that has really become a place where these art histories can be written, and in their volume 2, they dedicated it to these ideas of enduring connections. What I hope I've shown you in this kind of crisscrossing across Oceania in amount of time is the way in which these works of artists, the works of curators, the works of art historians are really allowing our histories to be in a constant state of becoming. Malo pito.
Thank you all for stellar presentations this morning, starting with Gilan Tawadros, who actually presented a very important chapter in the new art history narrative of the world, and reminded us of Stuart Hall and all the contributions that she has done in the past. Thank you. Thank you for the fantastic performance too. So I want to start off with Nina's presentation, which kind of unpacked these complex networks among cultures, giving examples of from Manchester cotton factories to the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the links, and these kind of networks that were presented in manifested in the work of several artists. And in short, we can move on to Nina, who follows on to the similar histories, but of a different nations, the First Nations of the Oceania, and the networks between South Sea Islanders and the Hawaiian indigenous First Nations of Hawaii. And these kind of networks that continue to thrive. And I'm really impressed by the number of female artists that have been presented this morning and female leaders. But at the same time, when I think of the presentation of Professor of Eddie actually this morning, I remind myself that there were more male recipients of these honored titles than there were females. So just a quick observation on that. So, and I was wondering in regard to these merits that were bestowed by the monarchies in the UK, that there might have been two missed opportunities, one by those whose work highlights the injustices of the colonial powers over centuries, yet nothing was mentioned in that regard. There's such a contradiction here in terms, actually, for them to receive these merits and accept them at the same time. The irony of all this is that it is the monarchy that acknowledges these works that are anti-colonial or critical of the colonial period. So it's interesting to think about why do we come to this situation in the 21st century when the artwork is clearly sends one message, yet the action sends another message. And I mean, we have seen examples by artists such as Marlon Brando, the artist who refused to take the award, the most prized award in film industry, because of his stance with the American Indian First Nation. So that there are many precedents in other fields, but for some reason not in the art fields. And I was wondering also about the press, the power of the press, which we appreciate that over the years, but now we have a different situation with the social media. So what do you think of that in relations to this power that seems to have brought to the fore certain artists versus the majority that also needs some type of acknowledgement for their work, that we rarely see their names in the press or highlighted. So there are these sort of what's sometimes referred to as the darlings of the press, and then the rest. So that I thought your presentation brought this point out, which continues to be an issue with the art field, in this field. That it's an important point. Thank you for bringing this out. And we're very, very impressed with your amazing presentation. So thank you for that. And it's sort of, there seem to be 4 different topics, but they all converge at one point. And that is looking forward to the new histories, writing a new chapter, and continue the work of Gillan and Invia and Stuart Hall and all those who started so long ago and pioneered in this area, in this field. So we're not going to open it to questions, but please limit your questions to like a 1-sentence question, if possible, so that we can take as many questions as possible, because we have a limited time and a very strict order here. So, any question?
Thank you very much. My name is Naminata Diabate, and I'm a fellow at the Africa Institute. So I just wanted to ask Anna this question. There is an emphasis and an investment in the question of care. So I wonder to what extent we can think about the idea of pleasure. Is that a way in which we can read into this text an idea of pleasure, which is already always complicated? So, I mean, I have another question for Tonga, but I'm just going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think, sorry, I think that for all three of the artists, at least when I've spoken with them, you know, pleasure also comes from those acts of care, and it also comes from the process, because I think it's not, what I really love about both Shiraz and Jasmine's work, and I've had many conversations with them over the years, is that the idea of care is not the sort of end point, but actually embedded in how they're researching, how they're moving through the archives, who they're speaking with. I mean, Jasmine often talks about actually communing with her ancestors while she's in the archives. And that, for her, those kinds of movements and practices are also really, really central to experiences and practices of pleasure. And I think also, and you know, this is something Shiraz describes too, but I think for Jasmine too, pleasure is also connected to the way that that her process is for her community. So, you know, she's witnessing, she's creating these moments of care and restoration, but through that, it's also about bringing pleasure, you know, to, and again, as you say, there are many different aspects of pleasure, but certainly joy, right, is, you know, it's about bringing joy to move away from the narrative of trauma. Do you have anything to add? You know, Jazz. No, I think
Hello. Thanks a lot, everyone, for 4 fabulous presentations. My name is Sonia. I'm an artist. I now live in Delhi. In the late 90s, when I went to England to study, it was a moment very ripe with, for me, my first forays into how I started to understand the Black movement, etc. I'll cut it really short and come to what I'm trying to say now, that there was a lot of hope and a feeling of things which were happening and all around me. And now somehow there is a feeling of ennui, and that bothers me. And I will jump to what Eddie kept saying. Eddie, you kept saying your time is up. And while I appreciate I don't want to appreciate the irony in that, you have to be a little careful not to keep saying your time is up.
May I remind you to please present a question and limit it to a very short one, please.
I have the mic. Hello. James Meyer, National Gallery, United States. Eddie, it was a very dramatic talk, beginning with the 1989 show of Rashid Areen, The Other History, and ending up in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Could you do now have time to tell us more about that transition? Are you narrating a kind of assimilation of Black practitioners into a neo-imperial model? They're literally getting those titles that you enumerated. What is the historical process you're describing? Is it assimilation? What is its relationship to the art market? What is the story you're telling?
Well, I think in lots of ways, James, I mean, that's a great question, of course, and thank you so much for it.
Please speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry, is that not working? Okay, sorry. Is that, oh, that's better. Okay. Thank you, James, for a very nuanced question. And it's a question that points to many different elements of the story. You know, in some respects, I didn't touch on this in the talk, but in some respects, the broader context that is in my mind, I think perhaps it's in my mind from my time as a practicing artist. I was first an artist many years ago, before I moved into writing about art and curating, and latterly into academia. So I was first an artist, and working alongside other artists broadly of the same age group as myself, a number of whom were making extraordinarily penetrating work that had within its sights the legacies of empire. You know, not only the damage, destruction wrought internationally by the British Empire, but also its legacies. So, for someone like me, I do struggle to reconcile the perpetuating of the honest system via this explicit, uncritical reference to the British Empire. That's one aspect of what drives me to do this current research that I'm undertaking. The other thing that informs my work is the ways in which history manifests itself as the child of immigrants, as the child of Caribbean immigrants who came to Britain in the mid-1950s, suffered horrendously in terms of racism over several decades, leading their presence and presence of people like them leading to the rise of black British people, a new demographic, a different demographic. You know, black people have been in Britain for thousands of years, but Black Britain was a new entity that arose in the 1970s. Really what I'm also trying to come to terms with is this onward movement of history in which there is a sense, I think you probably just mentioned this, James, of assimilation. You know, this sense of people becoming British. I mean, moving perhaps from being black British to becoming to becoming British. This is perhaps a key aspect. And the other thing which I'll make mention of, I'm aware that time is short. Sorry to go back to this thing about my time being up, but we know that the art world is most comfortable with dealing with limited numbers of artists. You know, so you know, there are. I mean, in the world there are hundreds of thousands of artists. There might be more than hundreds of thousands of artists, but very few of them are going to get any kind of major recognition. It just so happens to be the case, I think, at the present time that amongst those artists being recognized, there are a significant number of artists from minority ethnic backgrounds. Quite what this means in the long term, quite how this will play out over the next 10, 20, 30 years or whatever, I think we'll have to see, you know. But we went from a long time, you know, we went from several hundred years of the British art world not recognizing artists of color to a kind of a recognition, you know. Quite what this means, quite how we've come to this, you know, I think we're still trying to figure these things out, you know. But of course, you ask a very nuanced question, a question that points to complicated answers. But it's important for us to always think of the wider contexts. Yeah. Thank you, James, for that question.
Professor Chamber, this Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. Oh, do I need to raise my hand? Oh. And thank you everyone for this incredible presentation. I'm going to have a question for Eddie Chamber, but I want to say to Mithu, sir, you are brilliant. This was spectacular. This was ground shaking and moving and fantastic. But because your presentation, Eddie Chamber, was so compelling, and I read it almost as performative in a very deep way, but also ones that brought to the floor profound questions about how we artists, and in this time, we negotiate the relation with the still existing forms in some way of residual colonial power. And as I thinking about all the artists that have the great awards from the British Empire are my colleagues and my friends. Some of them I could call them my friends. And what is the negotiation that they need to go to accept that prize? And don't compare themselves necessarily when Marlon Brando refused it. And there is an incredible moment for questioning, for thinking, for a strategy, for how do we deal in the present with the past. And what decision we making in the present that allowed us for agency, for building the future that we aspire. Because we know what we want. I don't talk in the name of them, I'm talking in my name. I am the Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair Professor of Fine Arts in Vanderbilt. Very first Black woman, very first Caribbean woman, very first woman with that title. He wasn't a slaveholder. But I see that in the way that in the work that I want to do for repair, for transform, fighting structures that were and is still dominant in United States and in the world, I want that title. And I want to galvanize and literally make explosion within that title. So I using the Cornelius Vanderbilt in a way to do work that otherwise I cannot do. And I am thinking if having a OV or officer or CV or whatever the different titles are to a moment of restorative work and a moment of repairing work that is needed. And not of complacency or in any way of accepting, but fighting back and showing access to new power and new knowledge and new making. Because when I am thinking of the work that Jinka Chonibari, Isaac Julian, David, all of them are doing, is mining the institution from within. Thank you.
Thanks, Magda. I just wanted to ask Anna a question, if I may. I know our time is nearly out, and I just wanted to ask you, you've done so much work, so much important, valuable, substantial work with a number of British artists. I just wanted to ask you if some of the things I touched on had ever risen in your kind of communications and conversations. I mean, if any of them made references to the ways in which they were being recognized. I mean, not only in the honors system, but the wider recognition that some of these artists are now getting. I wondered if that was ever part of the conversations the extensive conversations that you've had with so many artists.
Thank you for that question. I think, so Labena and I have spoken about her honours. I mean, Chica could talk about Sir Isaac and Sir David, but, and Labena sort of, and that's why I love that picture of her. She doesn't dress up either. Like she takes it with this kind of irony, and I think it's partly, what Magda was saying, sort of understanding what that title can mean in a British context, but also wearing it very lightly and being, kind of being able to play with it. And I've always thought that the way Yinka uses it in his title is also a kind of, kind of an ironic take. But yeah, I mean, I have heard both from other artists. I think I've heard both of these sorts of responses, kind of Magna's point about, which I think is also it does also relate to many of us academics and where we are, and kind of tensions between where we are and the work we do, but and then others sort of, you know, kind of having this, not being able to reconcile. So, but I think it's okay to have, as you know, to have both those positions side by side, because that's another way of, I think, negotiating what these past histories, you know, cannot fully be come to resolution in the present.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'd like to direct my question to Eddie. My name's Josette, and I'm from the US, and I'm an art consultant. What were the impacts of a visual artist non-acceptance of an OBE, MBE, and so forth, and had that had a negative impact on the artist's career in Britain?
Well, it's a difficult question because we only, oh, sorry, thank you. Because we only have the most partial information. As I mentioned towards the end of my talk, the protocol is that people who decline honours don't make it known. I mean, there are people who've made it known. There's a celebrated poet in Britain, Benjamin Zephaniah, who turned down an OBE some years ago, and is widely respected or is widely recognised for doing so. But say somebody like him is a rarity because we don't know what we don't know in terms of we don't know who's turned these things down. It's unlikely, I think, that to refuse. Sorry, this is I'm making it sound like I'm making a judgment here, which I'm not. But I think it's unlikely that it would adversely impact an artist's career were they to turn an honour down. Because the system is not transparent in any respects. It's like, as I mentioned before, there's a branch of the government that kind of establishes these things, but it's very, very secretive. We don't get to know who is nominated. We don't get to know if people need to be nominated. I mean, one gets a sense that if you're on that kind of gravy train, for want of a better word, then you could move through the ranks from an OBE from an MBE to a CBE and to a knighthood or whatever, without the need of somebody advocating for you. One suspects perhaps that others might need to be nominated, but again, these systems are not transparent, so therefore it's very difficult to talk in terms of consequences or adverse consequences because the system is not designed to be transparent. These stories they're in the news twice a year. They're in the news at New Year, and they're at the news at the time of the monarch's birthday. I don't know when King Charles was born, so I don't know when his birthday honours list will come out. But most people have a very passing interest in the honours system. It's not news for weeks on end. It's news for as part of the news cycle. It's news for a day or so. That's why if we were to research, if I were to conduct if I was to conduct research into the honours system and its relevance, its embracing of minority ethnic people, it's a painstaking process because it means looking at documents in certain kind of ways. It means reading documents for certain kind of names. It means reading documents for certain kinds of awards. Information may or may not be present. As I mentioned before, Hamid was first recognised for services to black women artists, subsequently for services to art, which is a very different kind of construct. So there are all these layers of signifiers that would need to be properly chronicled or properly unpacked. But to answer your question, I personally doubt if there is any kind of adverse if there were any adverse consequences to declining an honour. But I don't say that. I don't say that with any kind of intended bias. I'm simply saying that as a kind of a disinterested statement.
I think I have the mic, so I can maybe say a few words. First, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that all the questions that came from the audience were really on things that are well-known, debated, and of course very important. But I thought within this, even though the panel overall brought in this, like expanded the cartography, of course, of art, but also brought interconnectedness of all of these disciplines. But I felt also that Nina Tonga pointed us to a direction that has been really still marginalized within art history and even within in this room too. So I feel my question is not to really just address it because it was neglected, but I think it's a genuine question to say, what is the status of indigenous or First Nation art histories across and the interconnections between, let's say, Aboriginal Australian or Native American and others, because there are some things that actually tie the history of these different nations, which is the claim to sovereignty within nation states, and whether there are actually dialogues that are happening, and what is the status of that within, like, Australia, New Zealand, America, and all the Pacific Islands, and how is it now within the global? Of course, there is recognition, like the artists that are included in the Venice Biennial or others, but these are sometimes fashionable things when, fly-by-night or drive-by shooting curators try to make their work global. I'm really interested in the what kind of progress that are made, because, and this ties to what actually Eddie Chambers' work is, that might it be that, Eddie, that what's happening now in terms of recognition, recognizing all the complexity and the complicity of the status quo, could it be to the fact that the struggle of people like you, Rashid Arain, and others who actually provided not only the very raw material, which is by exhibiting, curating these people, even though it's outside the mainstream, but they also provided the discourse that made every, director of a museum recognizing the shameful history of those institutions in terms of exclusion. This is the irony that's now played in the US, which is suddenly, despite the availability and the discourse, there's this explosion in post-George Floyd, God bless his spirit, is that the Black Lives Matter, but the struggle of so many people like you in the UK, like in the US, the Rick Powells and others who really wrote that history, and it was ignored for a long time. But then suddenly, museums are actually scrambling to hire Black curators, and you get a lot of calls from different mainstream, if you have a student who's Black, and almost saying it that way, so they can, and that's happened. MoMA did that, the Met did that, Whitney did that in a span, like a short span of period. Suddenly there are all these Black curators who have been operating outside the mainstream, and they're there. But I'm interested in hearing from Nina Tonga's perspective.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that in terms of thinking about Indigenous practice globally, is that there really is this kind of, more than a kind of moment in time, but something that I believe has been building for a very, very long time, where indigeneity is not just about recognizing indigeneity to a particular place and a time, but also this affiliation with other Indigenous peoples who have had similar experiences. And there is a very thriving First Nations network globally now. There are lots of scholarship and publications where that sense of connection, which is beyond just the Pacific Ocean, has really found a sense of solidarity. And I think that's also been supported by Indigenous peoples being able to take up really key positions in institutions. and positions that they perhaps were not afforded, if we say a decade or 2 decades ago. So thinking about not just art historians, but curators, thinking about anthropologists teaching in our institutions and creating courses. So I think it really is a bit of an ecology that exists within, if I could speak to that. I also want to say that these things are, while we've been talking about the 2000s, sort of, a lot of these things are not new, and I just wanted to point to one example, if I may, of the kinds of connections between different Indigenous peoples, and just to also acknowledge the amazing film by John Harvey last night that we all watched. And we spoke this morning about breakfast because in some of the scenes, what I noticed was there was the leader of the Polynesian Panthers that came out of Auckland that was part of standing in solidarity at that particular moment. So while I mentioned at the end of mine talking about Mauna Kea, which is right now, these kinds of support networks, these kinds of calls to each other are so long, like they're millennia long. And that may be about sharing a particular sense of place, but also a shared sense of mobility and genealogy that I think is enduring. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you to our speakers and our audience. We will now break for lunch, which is again at the courtyard of the Al Qasimiyya School across the road. Our guides will guide you to the venue, and we'll be back here at 3 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.